He had it all: the perfect job, a beautiful girlfriend, and the best friend any man could ask for. Mark Bennett was a man who seemed to be living the dream. He was charming, successful, and well-liked by everyone around him. His girlfriend, Sarah, adored him. His best friend, Evan, was his confidant, his partner in crime. Together, they had been through everything, from wild parties to the quiet moments of camaraderie that only the closest of friends could share. They had been inseparable since childhood. Their bond was built on trust, respect, and loyalty. But beneath the surface, something dark was brewing. A betrayal so deep, so devastating, that it would destroy everything Mark held dear. And it all began with a woman who would turn his life upside down and set him on a path that would lead to a crime so shocking, it would leave everyone who knew him in disbelief. This is the story of a man who killed his best friend over a woman who would prove to be more deadly than he could ever imagine. Mark Bennett had always prided himself on being a good man, a man who played by the rules and made the right choices. He had a steady job as a senior executive at a successful tech company, a beautiful apartment in the city, and a girlfriend who was everything he could ever want. Sarah was sweet, intelligent, and devoted to him. But Mark wasn't satisfied. He had everything, yet something was missing. It was during a night out with friends, at a party that was supposed to be just another typical celebration, that Mark's life began to spiral. It was a night that would change everything. The night he met Lily. Lily was new to town. She was introduced by one of Mark's colleagues, a vivacious woman with an infectious smile and eyes that could captivate anyone who looked into them. She was different, wild, spontaneous, and free-spirited, a stark contrast to Sarah's grounded, wholesome demeanor. Mark couldn't help but notice her. He tried to resist, telling himself that he was committed to Sarah, that he loved her and couldn't risk ruining what they had. But Lily was persistent. She sought out Mark at every opportunity, leaning in close during conversations, laughing at his jokes in a way that made him feel special, wanted. Slowly, over the weeks that followed, Mark found himself thinking about Lily more and more. The connection he felt with her was undeniable, an intense attraction that he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't long before things began to shift. He started spending more time with Lily, taking her out for drinks, laughing and talking about everything and nothing. It was all harmless fun at first, just a little flirtation, a bit of excitement in his otherwise predictable life. But one night, as the alcohol flowed freely, Mark found himself kissing Lily. It was a kiss that was both thrilling and terrifying, the kind of kiss that changes everything. But what Mark didn't anticipate was how this would affect Evan, his best friend, his brother in all but blood. Evan had always been there for him, the one person Mark could count on no matter what. And Sarah had trusted Evan too. They were family. So when Evan found out about the kiss, everything changed. Evan had always suspected that something was off between Mark and Lily, but it was the discovery of the kiss that shattered their friendship. The confrontation was inevitable. Mark had known it was coming, but nothing could have prepared him for the intensity of Evan's anger. Evan's betrayal hit Mark harder than he could have imagined. The confrontation took place in the very place where their friendship had been built, in the garage of Mark's house. They had spent countless hours there, talking about everything from life to women, from their hopes to their fears. But that night, it was different. "You've crossed the line, Mark," Evan had said, his voice thick with emotion. "You slept with her. My girl. My best friend's girl. I thought you were better than this. You don't get to do this to me." Mark tried to explain, tried to make Evan see that it wasn't like that it was just a kiss, nothing more. But Evan wouldn't hear it. The rage in his eyes was unmistakable. He had been betrayed, and the depth of his hurt and anger clouded his judgment. He grabbed Mark by the collar, shaking him as if trying to wake him from a nightmare. Mark's world tilted as Evan screamed at him, words that cut deeper than any physical blow. In that moment, something inside Mark snapped. The pressure, the guilt, the rage, it all collided. He couldn't stand the thought of losing everything: his best friend, his girlfriend, the life he had carefully constructed. But most of all, he couldn't stand the fact that Evan had betrayed him first. Evan had crossed the line by confronting him in this way. He had humiliated him, and Mark couldn't let that happen. In a split second, Mark reached for the nearest object, a wrench, heavy and cold. He swung it with all his might, striking Evan in the head. The sound of metal against bone was sickening, a grotesque crack that echoed through the garage. Evan collapsed to the ground, his body twitching, blood pooling around him. Mark stood there, frozen, the wrench still gripped tightly in his hand. He had just killed his best friend. What happened next was even more chilling. Mark stood over Evan's body, the adrenaline surging through his veins. He couldn't believe what he had just done, couldn't believe that he had taken a life. The weight of his actions began to set in, and fear gripped him. What if someone heard? What if someone saw? What if the police came? But there was no turning back. Mark knew that. His life, his world, had just imploded. He had lost everything in one fatal mistake, a moment of blind rage that had cost him his best friend's life. And now, he had to cover it up. Mark quickly moved into damage control mode. He dragged Evan's body to the far corner of the garage, making sure to wipe away any traces of his fingerprints. He cleaned the wrench, hiding it in a place where no one would think to look. He knew he couldn't risk anyone finding out, especially Sarah. If she found out the truth, it would destroy her. It would destroy him. But as Mark stood there, staring at the lifeless body of his best friend, he realized something even more terrifying. He had no idea how to cover this up. What was he going to say? How would he explain Evan's sudden disappearance? His mind raced, trying to come up with a believable story, but nothing seemed to fit. Everything he could think of only made the situation worse. He had crossed a line, one he couldn't erase, one that would haunt him for the rest of his life. But as he stood over Evan's body, one thought kept running through his mind. How could he ever face the people he loved again? Mark made his decision. He would make sure Evan's death was seen as an accident. He would stage the scene to look like a tragic mistake, a terrible accident that no one could have foreseen. But as he started to put his plan into motion, he didn't realize that the truth had already begun to unravel. Someone had already seen something, and soon, the walls would close in on him. What started as a betrayal over a woman had become a deadly game of deception. And now, Mark's future was hanging by a thread. Would he be able to escape the consequences of his crime, or had his perfect life already crumbled beyond repair? Mark believed he could control the situation, make the death look like an accident, hide his tracks, and walk away unscathed. But in reality, he had made the one mistake that would destroy him. Someone had seen something, and no matter how far Mark tried to run from the truth, it would catch up to him. Mark's first instinct was to get rid of the body. His mind raced as he tried to figure out how to make Evan's death seem like an accident. He couldn't afford to let anyone discover the truth, especially not Sarah, his girlfriend. She had no idea what had happened between him and Lily, let alone the murder he had just committed. If Sarah found out, it would be over. She'd never forgive him, and neither would anyone else. Mark spent hours cleaning up the garage, erasing any trace of the violent act he had just committed. He moved the body to an area where it would be less likely to be discovered, then staged the scene, making it appear as though Evan had tripped and fallen. The wrench was carefully hidden, the blood cleaned from the floor. Mark's hands shook with the weight of his actions, but he pushed the fear down, focusing on the task at hand. He had to get it right. After a few hours of frantic work, Mark took a deep breath. The garage was spotless. The body was hidden. He couldn't believe what he had done, but there was no time for regret. He had to act fast, and he had to act calm. The next morning, Mark made his first move. He sent Sarah a text, telling her that he was worried about Evan. He hadn't heard from him in a while. He played it off as concern for his friend, not wanting to raise any suspicions. But deep down, Mark knew that it wouldn't take long for Evan's absence to be noticed. He needed to make sure the police didn't find any signs of foul play. But as the hours ticked by, the cracks in his plan began to appear. A phone call came through from Sarah. She had been trying to reach Evan for hours, and she was starting to get worried. Mark did his best to stay calm, assuring her that everything was fine and that Evan was just busy with work. But something in Sarah's voice made him uneasy. She was starting to sense that something was wrong. It was then that Mark received the second unexpected call. The first was from Sarah, but this one was from the police. Detective Harper had been investigating Evan's disappearance, and she had just received an anonymous tip, a tip that would set the investigation in motion. The tip was vague but unsettling. The informant had seen something strange the night of Evan's death. Mark couldn't help but feel the growing sense of panic in his chest. The walls were closing in on him. Detective Lisa Harper was known for her sharp instincts and her ability to uncover the truth no matter how deep it was buried. She wasn't going to let Evan's case go cold. As she began her investigation, she found that there were inconsistencies in Mark's story. For one, Evan's phone had been found in his car, still unlocked, and it hadn't been used in over 24 hours, which was odd, especially considering how often Evan kept in touch with his friends. Lisa also discovered that there was no record of Evan taking any trips or leaving town. All signs pointed to the fact that something had happened to him right here in the city. But Mark had told the police that Evan was just missing and that he hadn't been able to get in touch with him. Lisa wasn't convinced. She ordered a search of Mark's property. Mark's mind raced. He could feel the heat of the investigation closing in, and every moment felt like an eternity. He had covered his tracks well, but the pressure was mounting. Detective Harper was too smart, and she wasn't going to stop until she got answers. Mark had to act quickly. Later that afternoon, Mark received a visit from Sarah. She had come over to check on him, still concerned about Evan. When she entered the house, Mark did his best to keep up the act, pretending to be calm and collected. But Sarah was not blind. She could see the unease in his eyes, the way his hands trembled as he poured her a glass of wine. "Mark, what's going on?" she asked, her voice soft but insistent. "Why are you so nervous?" Mark forced a smile, trying to keep his emotions in check. "It's nothing. Just worried about Evan. We've been friends for so long, and now he's gone." Sarah looked at him, her brow furrowing in concern. She was starting to see through his act. She had never seen Mark like this before. She had never seen him so guilty. As Sarah turned to leave, she glanced at Mark one last time. She wanted to believe him, but the seed of doubt had already been planted, and that seed would grow over the next few days as she began to notice the small inconsistencies in Mark's story. The way he avoided answering certain questions, the way he seemed too defensive, too eager to move on from Evan's disappearance. It all made her uneasy. Detective Harper's investigation continued to gain traction. The tipster had confirmed that someone had been seen leaving the scene of Evan's supposed accident, but the face of the person remained unknown. The case was heating up, and Mark knew that his time was running out. The truth was close to the surface, and there was only one thing left to do: get rid of the evidence. But as the investigation closed in, Mark had no idea that the worst was yet to come. Would the truth come to light before Mark could cover his tracks? Or was he about to make another fatal mistake that would seal his fate forever? It had been 3 days since Detective Harper had started her investigation into Evan's death, and she was relentless. The small inconsistencies in Mark's story had already raised suspicion, but it was the physical evidence that would seal his fate. The police had been conducting a thorough search of the area around Mark's home. Surveillance footage from the neighborhood showed a dark figure moving near the garage the night Evan had died. The footage was grainy, but the person's distinctive jacket was clear, and Mark's face was unmistakable. Detective Harper was confident she had her man, but there was one more thing to confirm. The garage was being re-examined for any traces of DNA. Evan's blood had been cleaned up well, but no one had thought to check the wrench until now. The wrench, the murder weapon, had been stashed away in Mark's shed, hidden under a pile of old tools. It was covered in fresh blood, a blood that didn't belong to Evan. Mark wasn't stupid. He knew what was coming. He had been watching the news, hearing the whispers, and feeling the weight of the evidence piling up. The anonymous tip was a gift from someone who clearly wanted to see him burn. And the moment that wrench was found, his world would come crashing down. Mark had been preparing for this moment. The day after Evan's death, he had started making plans to leave town, to start over, to disappear. He could never let the truth come out. He couldn't let his perfect life be destroyed by one night of violence, one rash mistake. But as the investigation neared its conclusion, Mark realized that there was no escape. Sarah had been growing increasingly suspicious. She had seen the changes in Mark's behavior, the nervousness, the lack of sleep, the way he avoided talking about Evan. She had tried to brush it off as stress, but deep down, she knew something was wrong. And then, she received a message that would change everything. It was an anonymous tip, a photo of the garage, showing Evan's body covered with a tarp and a shadowed figure in the background. The sender didn't give a name, but the message was clear: Mark had been involved in Evan's death. It was all the confirmation Sarah needed. She felt her stomach twist as she read the message over and over again. Her hands trembled as she called Mark, her voice shaky as she asked him where he had been the night Evan died. Mark tried to act calm, But Sarah could hear the panic in his voice. She could feel the lie, the deception, and it was breaking her heart. "Sarah, I told you. I don't know where he went. I thought he was just on a bender or something," Mark said, trying to sound convincing. But Sarah wasn't buying it anymore. "Don't lie to me, Mark," Sarah replied coldly. "I know the truth. I know what you did. Evan is dead, and you're responsible. I saw the message." Mark froze. The fear in his eyes was unmistakable. He knew his time was running out, and the one person who could have helped him, Sarah, was now turning on him. He had lost everything. It was the final straw. Mark could feel the pressure building. The police were on their way. Sarah had confronted him, and now, everything he had tried to hide was unraveling. Detective Harper was closing in on him with undeniable evidence. The blood on the wrench, the surveillance footage, the anonymous tip, all of it pointed to one person. Mark had always considered himself in control, but now, he was at the mercy of the very system he had once navigated with ease. And the woman who had driven him to this point, Lily, was nowhere to be found. She had disappeared, leaving Mark to take the fall for everything. As the police arrived at his door, Mark made one last desperate attempt to flee. He ran out the back door, hoping to escape, to vanish before it was too late. But Detective Harper had anticipated this move. She and her team were waiting for him. Mark's attempt to flee was futile. He had no chance. The police caught him before he could even make it out of the neighborhood. As they handcuffed him, Mark looked at Sarah for the last time. Her face was cold, her eyes filled with disgust and betrayal. He could see the pain in her expression, the heartbreak that he had caused. "You killed him," Sarah whispered, her voice broken. "You killed my best friend." Mark's heart sank. He had lost everything, not just his best friend, but the woman he loved. In his pursuit of power, control, and a fleeting moment of passion, he had destroyed his life and the lives of those around him. Now, the police were leading him away in handcuffs, and he knew there was no turning back. Mark Bennett, the once respected executive, the man who had it all, was now a murderer in the eyes of the law. He had killed his best friend over a woman, and now he would face the consequences of his actions. The trial would be brutal, the evidence damning. His best friend, Evan, would never have a chance to speak again. And as the truth came to light, Mark's carefully constructed life fell apart. He was no longer the man he once was. He was a criminal, a man who had betrayed everything he stood for. But there was something deeper at play here, a question that lingered in the minds of everyone who followed the case. What drives a person to kill their best friend for a woman? Was it greed, jealousy, or something darker? As Mark is led to trial, the questions only intensify. How could a man who had everything, a successful career, a loving girlfriend, a tight-knit friendship, throw it all away in a moment of rage? And now that the truth is out, will justice be served? Mark's trial was nothing short of a media frenzy. The courtroom was packed with reporters, eager to hear every detail of the case that had shocked the city. It wasn't just a murder, it was the betrayal of a lifetime. The friendship between Mark and Evan had been legendary, and the details of how a love triangle had spiraled into murder captivated the public's attention. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Rebecca Pierce, had a solid case. The evidence was overwhelming: surveillance footage, forensic reports, and Mark's own confession that had been pieced together in police interviews. But the defense wasn't about to go down without a fight. They argued that Mark had acted in a moment of temporary insanity, overwhelmed by the rage and jealousy caused by his unrequited feelings for Lily and the betrayal he felt from Evan. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," began Rebecca Pierce, her voice cold and commanding, "we are not here to discuss who was the victim of love. We are here to discuss a man who took the life of his best friend, his confidant, his brother in all but blood, over something as fleeting as jealousy. A moment of betrayal that led to the ultimate betrayal, a murder." Mark sat at the defendant's table, his face pale and his hands trembling. He had once been a respected figure, someone people looked up to, but now he was nothing more than a criminal in the eyes of the law. As the trial progressed, he began to break down emotionally. The weight of the truth, the reality of what he had done, was too much for him to bear. During the prosecution's opening statements, Mark's mind raced. He remembered the night of Evan's death, the rage that had consumed him, the desperation to feel loved, to feel wanted. He had never planned for it to go this far, but one moment of weakness, one mistake, had changed everything. The guilt ate away at him. He remembered Evan's face as he swung the wrench. The look of confusion and hurt in his eyes. It haunted Mark day and night. He tried to push it away, tried to convince himself that it was just an accident, that he had been provoked. But deep down, Mark knew the truth. He had killed his best friend. And now, there was no escaping the consequences. As the trial continued, Sarah was called to the witness stand. Her heart was heavy, her emotions raw. She had been Mark's girlfriend for over 2 years, and though she had been the one to uncover the truth, the pain of what had happened still lingered. The betrayal was too much to bear. Sarah had loved Evan like a brother, and now she was forced to testify against the man she had once trusted with her life. "Sarah," Rebecca Pierce asked, her voice gentle but firm, "what did Mark tell you about Evan's disappearance?" Sarah paused, the memories flooding back. She remembered the night she had confronted Mark, the lies he had told her, the way he tried to cover up the truth. She had never imagined that the man she had loved could be capable of murder. The shock still hadn't fully worn off. "Mark said he didn't know where Evan had gone," Sarah replied, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "He said he hadn't heard from him in a while, but I could tell something was off. He was acting strange, distant. I just didn't know what to think at the time." Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she continued. "But when I got that anonymous tip, when I saw the footage of the garage, everything clicked. I knew I had to confront him. And when I did, he didn't deny it. He didn't even try to make an excuse." The courtroom was silent as Sarah's words hung in the air. Mark's face flushed with shame, his eyes downcast. He couldn't bear to look at her. He had destroyed everything: his best friend, his relationship with Sarah, and his own reputation, all for a moment of jealousy and rage. The defense, led by Mark's attorney, Robert Harris, tried to mount a final effort to save him from a life sentence. They argued that Mark's actions had been the result of a temporary breakdown, a moment of intense emotional distress triggered by his feelings for Lily and the crushing betrayal he believed Evan had committed. They painted Mark as a man who had been pushed to the edge, someone who had cracked under the pressure of his emotions. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Robert Harris said, his voice pleading, "Mark Bennett is not a cold-blooded killer. He is a man who made a terrible mistake in a moment of intense emotional pain. He did not plan to kill his best friend. He didn't want to hurt anyone. He was confused, overwhelmed by his feelings. We ask that you consider this when you deliberate." But despite the defense's arguments, the evidence spoke for itself. The photos, the bloodstains, the wrench, everything pointed to one irrefutable fact: Mark had killed Evan, and he had done it deliberately. The jury would have to decide whether he would spend the rest of his life behind bars or whether they would grant him mercy for his actions. The courtroom was packed with anticipation as the jury deliberated. The weight of the decision hung heavy in the air. Mark sat at the defendant's table, his hands clenched, his eyes staring at the floor. He couldn't bear to look up, couldn't face the reality of what was about to happen. Hours passed, and then the moment came. The jury filed back into the courtroom, their faces solemn. The foreman stood and addressed the court. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Mark Bennett, guilty of first-degree murder." Mark's heart sank. The words seemed to echo in his mind, a ringing reminder of his ultimate betrayal. He had killed Evan, and now he would pay the price for it. Mark was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His once promising future, his career, and his relationship with Sarah were all gone. In a single moment of jealousy, he had destroyed everything. The man who had it all was now just another convict, another man behind bars, facing the consequences of his actions. As the guards led him away from the courtroom, Mark glanced over at Sarah. She was crying, but there was no sympathy in her eyes, only sadness. She had lost everything too: her trust, her love, and her faith in the man she had once called her boyfriend. Mark knew he would never be the man he once was. He would never get back what he had lost. And as he was led away in shackles, the reality of his actions settled in. He had killed his best friend, and no amount of regret could bring him back. The question remained, as it often does in cases like this: what drives a man to kill his best friend over a woman? Was it pure jealousy, a moment of rage, or something darker, a deep-seated need for control and power? Mark Bennett's story was a tragic tale of betrayal, obsession, and the devastating consequences of living in a world of lies. In the end, justice had been served, but the scars of his actions would last far longer than any sentence. Mark's life, once full of promise, was now nothing more than a shadow of what it had been. He had killed his best friend for a woman who was long gone, and in the process, he had lost everything. This is a story of love turned to obsession, friendship shattered by betrayal, and a man who thought he could control everything. But in the end, the truth always comes to light. What would you do if you found yourself at the mercy of your own lies? Would you be able to live with the consequences of your actions, or would the weight of your guilt crush you? But even now, as Mark faced the grim reality of his life behind bars, there were still unanswered questions lingering in the air. Could he ever truly face the consequences of his actions? Would the people he once loved ever forgive him? The day after the verdict was read, Mark sat in his prison cell. The harsh fluorescent lights above flickered as he stared blankly at the wall. His world felt like a haze of regret. He had killed Evan, his best friend, the man who had been by his side through thick and thin. And now, Mark was left to live with the consequences, locked away in a prison where the memories of that night would haunt him forever. He often thought about Evan's face, the confusion in his eyes before the fatal blow was struck. He had never intended for things to go that far. It had started as a fight, a misunderstanding over Lily, just a passionate argument that spiraled out of control. But now, Evan was gone, and Mark was the one to blame. Every night, as Mark lay on the cold, hard floor of his cell, he thought about Sarah. He remembered how she had looked at him during the trial, the pain in her eyes. He had lost her too. In his moment of anger, he had not only murdered his friend, but he had also destroyed the woman he loved. But as Mark sat there, consumed by guilt, something unexpected happened. Sarah visited him. It had been months since the trial, and Mark hadn't expected her to ever come near him again. But there she was, standing on the other side of the glass during a prison visitation. She looked different, hardened, more mature, but there was still a flicker of something familiar in her eyes. "Sarah," Mark said softly, his voice cracked from months of regret. "What are you doing here?" She stared at him for a long moment before speaking, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I'm here because I need to know why," she said. "I need to know what happened. How did it get to this point?" Mark swallowed hard, the weight of her words sinking deep into his chest. He had no answers for her. He could never explain how he had let everything slip away, how his obsession with a woman had turned him into a monster. But he knew this was his chance, his last chance to say something that might bring her closure. "I never wanted this, Sarah," he said, his voice barely a whisper. I just let my emotions take over. I couldn't think straight, and I lost everything. I lost you. I lost Evan. I lost myself." Sarah didn't say anything for a long time. She just looked at him, the silence stretching between them. "I wanted to believe you," she finally said, her voice breaking. "I wanted to believe that you were a better man than this. But now I see you for who you are." Mark's heart shattered as he watched Sarah turn and walk away, her footsteps echoing in the hallway of the prison. He had thought that, perhaps, he could rebuild some of what he had destroyed. But now, even the last thread of hope for redemption had slipped away. Months passed, and Mark's life behind bars became a monotonous cycle of regret. He couldn't undo what he had done. He couldn't bring Evan back, and he couldn't fix the shattered relationship he had once had with Sarah. He was locked in a cage of his own making, a man consumed by guilt and the weight of his choices. But it wasn't just his own life that he had destroyed. The consequences of his actions reached far beyond the prison walls. Sarah, who had been left to pick up the pieces of her shattered life, had begun to heal. She had moved on, found peace in a life without Mark. But the pain of losing Evan, of losing Mark, would stay with her forever. The story of Mark Bennett, the man who killed his best friend over a woman, serves as a tragic reminder of the destructive power of obsession and betrayal. A life once full of promise was torn apart by one moment of rage, one lapse in judgment. What drove Mark to kill his best friend? Was it pure jealousy? A hunger for control? Or was it a combination of 1,000 small choices, each leading him further down a path he couldn't escape? Mark Bennett may have been a man consumed by his own demons, but his story serves as a cautionary tale for us all. In the end, the consequences of our actions are inevitable, and sometimes they come at a price too high to pay. Mark's fate was sealed the moment he decided to betray Evan. There was no redemption for him, no second chance. He was just another man lost to the dark side of his own emotions. And in the end, justice was served. But the question remains, could Mark have turned things around? Could he have stopped himself before it was too late? Or was his fate inevitable, shaped by the lies and the choices he made? As we close this chapter, we leave you with that question. Can we ever truly escape the consequences of our own actions? Stay tuned for more gripping true crime stories, where the darkest secrets are always waiting to be revealed. If you found this story as chilling as we did, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. The truth is always darker than we think, and sometimes the cost of deception is too high to bear.